Thank you very much for having me today, everyone. And I'm sorry I can't join in person, but happy to be joining you from Berlin, from Transparency International's headquarters. It's an extremely timely discussion we're having today as we look ahead at really what is one of the most important days for EU democracy, the European Parliament elections next June. Of course, speaking on behalf of TI, what I would like to touch upon today in my keynote introduction is how populism and corruption are inherently interlinked. I think Marius already touched upon this in his introduction, but as we know, populism is the negation of pluralism, which is extremely harmful to representative democracy in Europe. And I want to start by emphasizing that if we want to actually protect and have a more resilient democracy in Europe, we need to root out corruption and achieve acceptable levels of integrity in political life. We need transparency, and we need much stronger accountability mechanisms to ensure abuses of power and breaches of the rule of law by governments are effectively monitored and enforced. Grievances about corruption have played a major role in propelling populists to power in Europe and globally as well. And we've seen that in trends in regards to election results. And nothing really tests people's trust in governments more than the multiple crises that we've seen in Europe over the last few years, whether that's the cost of living, the war in Ukraine or COVID, and also scandals around public spending, for example, around crisis such as the COVID-19 pandemic. However, undue influence over decision-making or poor enforcement of integrity safeguards and the threats to the rule of law are undermining government's effectiveness in the last few years as well. And that is a trend we've also seen. Unfortunately, the recent collection of public perception of political which is from our study, the Global Corruption Barometer, we sadly were startled by how much the public perception of low levels of political integrity existed in the region in light of these trends. So an average score of 100 in the EU was 48. Around half of the people in the EU think that bribes or connections are commonly used by businesses to secure government contracts, and less than a third of people think that leaders don't take the views of citizens to an account when making decisions, which are really not good statistics to be able to share. And when we're thinking about how this ties into populism, well, we know that corruption and a lack of trust facilitates populism, but in turn, populism also facilitates corruption. And I want to unpack that a little bit in my introduction now. So we know that, as I mentioned, that corruption can contribute to the erosion of people's trust in governments and other public institutions. It can heighten political polarization. It badly damages our democratic institutions, but it also means that we have weak policy making. It perpetuates inequalities, and also, the systems that are meant to look after it's like our health system, for example. And obviously, there's many different types of populism. But what is often inherent in a populist rhetoric is the fight against corruption. Populist leaders often stress that the message of elites working with the people. They denounce corruption in government in order to stylize themselves as an outsider, for example. And we have seen that trends in election results, or that high or rising corruption is a significant factor in explaining the success, for example, of anti-establishment parties in Europe. For example, that a link to perhaps a loss of trust or bad government. A notable case, of course, is Viktor Orban, who's been in power in Hungary since 2010. When he came to power, the fight against a corrupt system represented a key policy priority that he heightened in his election campaign. And we've also seen in terms of the last 12 months that corruption certainly had an impact on voting behaviour in regards to anti-establishment parties winning, for example, in Italy or Sweden, or most recently in Slovakia over the last few days as well. And of course, these concerns of corruption are, they're they're valid considerations, but often populist leaders, rather than effectively fighting corruption when they get in power, use it as a smokescreen to actually redistribute the spoils of corruption among their allies. And I can share a couple of examples. So in many ways, populism even facilitates new forms of corruption. The populist track record of countering corruption is not good in Europe. They can often be very ineffective in fighting forms of corruption, just I mentioned they've made during their campaigns, or most critical, dismantle key democratic institutions or accountability mechanisms that should be there to actually fight corruption and have effective transparency within the political system within a country. For example, the former Czech Prime Minister Babiš, it was dogged by multiple allegations of severe corruption and conflict of interest scandals. Viktor Orban, as I mentioned before, his rhetoric and politics not only failed to fight systemic corruption in Hungary, but really changed even the logic of corruption in terms of forms of state capture, basically narrowing the power to a narrow group of elites. And only was able to really secure the power, but also facilitate corruption, removing safeguards and removing that state apparatus to be able to actually highlight issues of corruption, for example, in public procurement being one area in particular. We've also seen trends that when populist parties are in power in Europe, this could also weaken the enabling environment for independent journalism, harassment against civil society or against marginalized groups, which limits their ability to have that check and balance power on public decision-making, and it undermines democracy. For example, prior to the 2022 elections last year in Slovenia, there was strong efforts of controls of checks and powers being undermined, judges and prosecutors being targeted, media and press agencies having their funding cut. And that's, again, one way that the fight against corruption is severely undermined by populism within the political system. But I'd like to end with my reflection on a positive note, as we introduced at the beginning, in the role that transparency and integrity have in fighting all forms of political corruption, which is so key for building back that trust with EU citizens. So obviously transparency and building that trust, it's key to understanding, for example, how public money is being spent, who is your MP meeting with, or the process of public decision-making itself within the political process. And greater transparency and integrity are important preventive measures in protecting democratic systems when they are captured or undermined, for example, by populist, for example, parties at the national level. And when we're talking about political corruption, we're thinking about things like manipulation of policies, institutions, rules of procedures, and also, for example, political decision makers abusing their positions for private gain or wealth as well. So in terms of combating that with transparency and integrity, what needs to be prioritized? Well, firstly, access to information is the first step to allow citizens, but also oversight bodies to be more involved and exercise influence in regards to when corruption is a particular risk, or when there's been a breaking of a particular rule in regards to a code of conduct or the ethics of a political or public actor. This also empowers media and civil society, but also whistleblowers, and also promotes a culture of inclusion and openness to actually request transparent information about public decision making. And this also relates to open data, so that everyone has available to open data format of political decision making. It's a really vital tool for reducing corruption. There's access to official statistics on government spending, details of legislation, enhancing that accountability mechanism to understand and build greater trust on where that money is being spent. Also, that there's enforcement of laws and regulations on regards to unethical behaviour, such as ethics standards and a code of conduct being in place. And also that there's sanction mechanisms in place that when those rules are broken, that also public officials are held accountable. And that also includes a proper integrity mechanism in place within public office. So political decision makers and power holders are subject to scrutiny by the public and have those institutional checks and face consequences for when they're using power for private gain as well. So to end, the transparency and accountability of parliaments and governments are really key factors in building public trust and the institutions and ensuring these institutions are more resilient in regards to our democracy within the EU. I think from what I've shared today, I've highlighted really how EU countries have more to do to improve political integrity and those resulting perceptions, really to emphasise the future of democracy and EU citizens' trust in their institutions, and that social cohesion, which prevents populism, really hangs in the balance as we currently speak. But I'm really excited to hear the further discussions to be had today on these themes. Thank you very much.